Good morning, all. How are you feeling? Week 15 or 16 of lockdown we're now in. Yeah, I'm getting pretty tired of it as well, I have to say. I've been looking at the texts for today and the readings that there are, and actually the gospel is quite an odd one to preach on. It's quite a difficult one. But as I was preparing for the service, I chose a sending out prayer. It's in a book I used to prepare the services called Prayer and Prayer Activities. I was sent a copy because I wrote some of the material within it. There you go. But this last prayer is not one of mine, but it really resonated with me. It's a final prayer. It said, "May our lives yield a rich harvest, and may we learn to live with our weeds and those of others, and leave the act of judging to you alone." The reading today is from Matthew 13, where Jesus says, "Let the wheat and the weeds grow together until the harvest." It's a big question. What makes a weed a weed? Some people would say any plant that's not where it ought to be growing. My garden at first sight looks rather unruly. The flower beds at the side have been allowed to grow rather wild. I have one border which is designated a wilderness zone. It's full of ground elder, nettles, dandelions, wild mustard. There's a crabapple tree and a patch of brambles which happily climbs over the crabapple tree. Several flowering currant seedlings have appeared, along with various different grasses, etc. The only patches that I clear in it are the sections around the rhubarb and around a rosebush which was given me when I moved here. Is it a border full of weeds? Or is it a border full of fruitfulness? Only time will tell. I do know that even if it is full of weeds, the birds and the butterflies like it. I get a whole host of wildlife, birds, including this last week a couple of goldfinches perched on the ground elder eating the seed heads. Now, I only deal with the border when it starts to die back in the autumn. On the other hand, I've spent time weeding my vegetable patch this week, which it definitely needed. I've had to be very cautious, however, as weeds have roots which often undermine the vegetables. In some cases, I've left the weeds in to avoid disturbing the vegetables. What often happens is that as the vegetable grows and gets bigger, they suppress the weeds and the weeds die. When I look at my own life, I sometimes have the same struggle. What in my life is a weed and what is a fruitful plant? What do I need to weed out and suppress, and what do I need to develop? Are there things within me which, as they grow, will suppress my weeds? It's actually a good question to ask oneself. There are times when it's obvious to me what my weeds are, the bad habits that I've picked up over a lifetime. For example, my tendency to get so distracted by a new book and to read that I abandon my computer and my work. There's my impatience, though I'm working on that. My low self-esteem. I've learnt this is not humility, but for me it stems from a warped sense of pride, and that in turn leads to a tendency to overwork. I recognise that it's unhealthy and I'm working on it. I'm sure there are lots of other weeds that my friends, family and members of the congregations could point out to me. Do it to me gently, please. But there are other things in my life that I used to think were weeds, and they've turned out to be some of the brightest flowers in the garden. My daydreaming, what I used to think of as being lazy, has turned out to be some of the most fruitful time for prayer. My handicrafts, my knitting, sewing, crochet, combined with my daydreaming, have hopefully enriched the lives of others through the retreat leading that I do. I've been accused of being bolshy, and I've learnt over time that actually, when I use that side of me properly, it means I can be assertive on behalf of others. And actually, it needs to be there if I am to be a leader. I'm still working on leadership techniques. When I was younger, I had an incredibly short temper, and my parents quite rightly taught me that it had to be under control. The problem was, it went the other direction. I started to see being angry as a lack of self-control. I still have a temper. It is just very controlled now. But it took work before I started to understand and realize that anger is a positive emotion when used in the right way. My anger was a weed which I attempted to remove altogether before realizing that that was the wrong thing to do and far more damaging in the long run. Sometimes what we perceive to be weeds in our lives turn out to be fruitful. And sometimes what we think are the most fruitful parts of our lives turn out to be barren. And some of those things we will not know or discern until the last days. I encourage you today to, this week even, just to take a look at the garden of your lives. Examine it in detail. Are there fruits and flowers that need fertilizing, that need work on to develop more? Are there weeds that could do with being suppressed? But more, I encourage you to just be, to live with both weeds and fruit, recognizing that no individual is ever entirely fruitful, and rarely is an individual entirely composed of weeds. We are all complicated people. We are a mixture of good and bad, fruit and weeds. When we look at our own life, we can start to think about it. When we look at somebody else's garden, we should be admiring the fruit and the flowers, not criticizing the weeds. It's not our task to weed someone else's garden unless they ask us. We're first called to look at our own ground, and sometimes we're called to just live with it. Amen.